The sound didn't belong in a courtroom, it belonged in a place where consequences had already failed. The sharp crack cut through the polished silence, echoing off marble walls and polished oak like something alive, something that refused to be ignored, and for a split second, every single person in that room forgot how to breathe as Emily Carter's head turned slightly with the impact, her hand instinctively rising to her cheek while her other arm stayed wrapped protectively around the gentle curve of her 7-month pregnancy. Her body frozen not in fear but in disbelief, because this wasn't supposed to happen here, not under fluorescent lights, not beneath the American flag, not in a room built for justice. Phones didn't ring, papers didn't shuffle, even the air seemed to hold still, as if the entire courtroom had been suspended in a single impossible moment, and somewhere in the back row, a chair creaked softly, the smallest sound amplified into something intrusive. Something almost disrespectful to the silence that followed, while Vanessa Cole stood there in her tailored cream suit, chin slightly raised, fingers still tense from what she had just done, her expression caught somewhere between triumph and calculation, like she hadn't expected the room to react this way, like she thought the rules didn't apply to her, and maybe for a long time, they hadn't. 30 seconds earlier, the tension had already been building, invisible but suffocating. As whispers passed between spectators and the low hum of anticipation settled into the space, everyone aware that this wasn't just another divorce hearing, not when Daniel Brooks sat at the defendant's table in a navy suit worth more than most people's monthly rent, his posture relaxed, confident, as if he were attending a board meeting instead of watching his marriage dissolve in real time, his eyes barely flickering toward Emily, like she had already become part of his past, something filed away and forgotten, while Vanessa leaned slightly toward him. Her presence unmistakable, her confidence louder than any words. She spoke, and Emily stood alone across the room, her simple gray dress a quiet contrast to the sharp lines and expensive fabric surrounding her, her fingers tightening around a thin silver bracelet that peeked from beneath her sleeve, a small, almost invisible detail that no one noticed, no one except the man seated high above them all, watching from behind the bench, his expression unreadable, his gaze lingering just a moment too long on that bracelet, on her name written neatly across the case file in front of him, Carter, a name that meant nothing to everyone else in that room, but something unsettled, had already begun to stir beneath the surface, though no one could see it yet, not even Daniel, who shifted slightly in his seat as if bored. As if the outcome had already been decided, as if power worked in straight lines and predictable endings, and maybe that's why no one moved when the moment broke, when tension finally snapped into action, because no one expected the first crack in the system to come from a single, sudden gesture that no one could undo, no one could pretend hadn't happened, and as Emily slowly lifted her gaze, not toward Vanessa, not toward Daniel, but forward, toward the bench, something in her eyes changed, something quiet but unshakable. Like she wasn't waiting to be saved anymore, like she already knew. Something the rest of the room didn't, and somewhere deep in the silence, beneath the shock and the whispers and the disbelief, the balance of power had already begun to shift, even if no one had realized it yet. No one spoke, but everything changed in the way people looked at her, because silence in a courtroom is never empty, it is filled with judgment, calculation, and the quiet shifting of sides, and as Emily Carter slowly lowered her hand from her cheek, her breathing steady, controlled, almost too calm for someone who had just been humiliated in front of strangers, it was that calm that unsettled people the most. Because it did not match the moment, it did not match the expectation of weakness that had been building around her for months, maybe years, and across the room Daniel Brooks finally looked at her, really looked at her, not with concern, not even with curiosity, but with irritation, the kind reserved for inconveniences that refused to disappear, his jaw tightening slightly as if this entire situation had gone off script, as if the neat, controlled narrative he had built was beginning to crack in ways he did not understand, and beside him Vanessa shifted her weight, her confidence flickering just enough to be noticed by those paying attention, because she had expected a reaction, tears, anger, something dramatic she could dismiss, but instead she got silence, and silence has a way of turning attention inward, of forcing people to question what they thought they knew, and somewhere near the jury box, A woman leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing, as if trying to reconcile the image in front of her with the story she had been told, because stories in rooms like this are never just facts, they are performances, carefully constructed, carefully delivered, and for the first time that morning, Emily was no longer playing the role assigned to her, and that was when the smallest detail began to matter, the silver bracelet catching the overhead light for just a fraction of a second, a subtle glint that might have gone unnoticed if not for the man seated above them, whose fingers paused ever so slightly against the edge of his bench, whose gaze returned to the file in front of him, to the name written in clean, deliberate type, Emily Carter. And then back to the bracelet, as if searching for something just beyond reach, something buried under years of distance and decisions that could not be undone, and though his face remained composed, the shift was there, subtle but undeniable, like a current running beneath still water, and the bailiff cleared his throat softly, uncertain, waiting for instruction that had not yet come, while the attorney at Emily's side, Olivia Hayes, leaned in just enough to whisper something that did not quite reach the microphone, her voice low, steady, a reminder rather than a warning, and Emily gave the smallest nod, not toward Olivia, not toward anyone in particular, but forward, as if acknowledging something inevitable, something already set in motion long before anyone else realized it, and Daniel exhaled sharply, breaking the silence with a sound that felt louder than it should have been, his hand adjusting his cuff as if to reclaim control. As if control could be restored with small, practiced gestures, but control is not something you hold on to when the ground beneath you begins to shift, it is something you realize you never fully had, and for a moment, just a moment, his eyes flickered toward the bench, toward the judge who had yet to speak, and there was a question there, brief but unmistakable, because power recognizes power, even when it does not understand it, and above them all. The man in the black robe finally moved, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with a deliberate calm that carried more weight than any outburst ever could, his hand resting flat against the wood, his gaze steady now, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, as if whatever he had been looking for had just revealed itself in the quietest possible way, and the room, still holding its breath, began to feel something new. Something unfamiliar, not shock, not confusion, but the first undeniable hint that the story everyone thought they were watching was not the story that was about to unfold. The first sound was not a voice but the soft, deliberate tap of wood as the judge's gavel met the bench, not loud, not aggressive, but precise enough to slice through the tension like a line drawn in stone, and every head in the room turned upward at the exact same moment, instinctively, because authority does not need to announce itself when it is real, it simply exists. And Judge Robert Carter did not raise his voice when he finally spoke, yet every syllable carried across the courtroom with a weight that settled into people's chests. "This court will maintain order," he said, his tone even, controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something that had not been there minutes before, something personal, though no one could yet name it, and the bailiff straightened immediately, stepping forward with a hesitation that suggested he was waiting for more instruction, while Vanessa's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders tightening as if she had suddenly remembered where she was, as if the rules she had ignored were now standing directly in front of her, and Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression sharpening, calculating, trying to read the shift in tone, because men like him were used to reading rooms, to anticipating outcomes before they happened, but this felt different, this felt like something he could not quantify. And that uncertainty pressed quietly against his confidence like a hairline crack in glass, and across the room Emily remained still, her hand now resting gently against her side, her breathing steady, her gaze forward, not defiant, not pleading, simply present, and Olivia Hayes adjusted a single document on the table in front of her, the movement small but deliberate, as if marking a transition, as if something invisible had just been unlocked. And the judge's eyes moved again, not scanning, not searching, but focusing, first on Emily, then briefly on the bracelet at her wrist, then back to the file, and this time when he spoke, there was a shift, subtle but undeniable. "Miss Carter," he said, and the name hung in the air longer than expected, as if it carried more meaning than a simple identification, as if it echoed somewhere beyond the walls of that courtroom, and Emily responded without hesitation, her voice calm, clear. "Yes, Your Honor." And for a fraction of a second, something in the judge's expression softened, not enough for anyone to notice consciously, but enough to register as a change in the atmosphere, like a current shifting direction beneath the surface, and Daniel's fingers paused against the armrest of his chair, his attention sharpening, because that moment, that almost imperceptible pause, did not fit into the version of events he had anticipated. And Vanessa glanced sideways at him, searching for reassurance that did not come, because even he could not explain what was happening now, and the judge leaned forward slightly, his hand resting flat against the bench, grounding himself in something unseen, something internal, before continuing. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice still controlled but now carrying a quiet authority that demanded attention rather than requested it, "I would like the record to clearly reflect all present parties." And the clerk nodded quickly, fingers poised over the keyboard, ready to capture every word, every detail, because something about this moment felt important, even if no one yet understood why, and as the names began to be read, one by one, each syllable landing with increasing weight, Daniel Brooks, Vanessa Cole, Olivia Hayes, the rhythm steady, procedural, familiar, until it reached the final name again, Emily Carter. And this time the judge did not immediately move on, this time there was a pause, deliberate, intentional, as his gaze settled on her once more, and in that silence, something invisible connected, something that had nothing to do with law or procedure and everything to do with truth waiting just beneath the surface. And for the first time since the hearing began, the room did not feel like a place where outcomes were decided by arguments or evidence alone, it felt like something else entirely. Something that had already begun to unfold long before anyone realized they were part of it. It was the pause that changed everything, not long enough to be called hesitation, but deliberate enough that no one could ignore it, and as the judge's gaze remained fixed on Emily Carter, the air in the courtroom seemed to tighten, like something unseen was drawing every thread of attention toward a single point, and Daniel felt it before he understood it, that subtle shift that no strategy could account for. His fingers curling slightly against the polished wood of the table as if grounding himself in something solid while the ground beneath him quietly began to move, and Vanessa, for the first time since she entered the room, did not look entirely certain of her place, her eyes flickering between Daniel and the bench as if searching for confirmation that the balance of power still leaned in her favor. But confirmation did not come, because above them all, Judge Robert Carter was no longer simply presiding. He was observing, measuring, and something in that observation carried a weight that reached beyond procedure, beyond protocol, and into something far more personal, though no one had yet spoken it aloud, and Olivia Hayes seemed to sense it too, her posture straightening just slightly as she slid a single document forward, her voice calm but purposeful as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, before we proceed further, we would like to submit additional evidence into the record." And the words landed cleanly, professionally, yet beneath them was something sharper. Something intentional, and Daniel's attention snapped toward her, irritation flashing across his face, because this was not part of the timeline he had anticipated, not part of the controlled progression he had expected to guide the outcome, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice measured but edged with impatience. "Your Honor, we were not notified of any new evidence." And for a moment, it seemed like the familiar rhythm of legal argument might reassert itself, that the structure of the courtroom would return to something predictable, something manageable, but the judge did not respond immediately, and that silence again stretched just long enough to matter, just long enough to unsettle, before he finally spoke, his tone unchanged yet carrying a quiet finality. "This court will review all relevant material." And the simplicity of the statement left no room for objection, no room for negotiation, and Daniel leaned back again, slower this time, his confidence no longer as effortless as it had been minutes ago, because something about the way the judge had said it suggested that the outcome was no longer something he could influence. And across the room Emily remained still, but there was a difference now, subtle yet unmistakable, a steadiness that felt less like endurance and more like certainty. As if she were no longer waiting for the moment to arrive but recognizing that it already had, and Olivia placed the document onto the clerk's desk, the soft sound of paper against wood carrying farther than it should have, drawing every eye in the room to that single point, and as the clerk accepted it, fingers moving quickly to log the submission, the judge's gaze followed, not the document itself, but the intention behind it, and for a brief second, his eyes lifted again to Emily, and this time there was no searching, no uncertainty. Only recognition settling into place with a quiet inevitability, like a puzzle piece finally aligning after years of absence, and in that moment, something invisible but undeniable passed between them, something that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with truth that could no longer remain buried, and though no words had yet been spoken to reveal it, the courtroom felt it, that shift from assumption to revelation, from control to consequence, and Daniel, watching it unfold without understanding, felt the first real hint of something he had not experienced in a very long time, not fear exactly, but the unmistakable realization that he was no longer the one in control of how this story would end. The moment the document left Olivia Hayes's hand, it stopped being just paper and became something else entirely, something heavier, something that carried consequences no one in the room could yet see, and as the clerk placed it carefully on the bench, aligning it with practiced precision, the faint sound of pages settling seemed louder than it should have been. As if the courtroom itself understood that whatever was inside those pages was about to change the direction of everything, and Judge Robert Carter lowered his gaze to the document, his expression composed, unreadable, yet there was a stillness to him now that felt deliberate, like a man bracing not for impact, but for confirmation, and Daniel watched closely, his attention sharpening into something almost aggressive, because control for him had always meant staying one step ahead, anticipating the move before it happened, but this was something he had not anticipated, and that unfamiliarity pressed against him in quiet, unsettling ways, while Vanessa shifted again, her confidence thinning at the edges, her eyes darting briefly toward the gallery where whispers had begun to ripple softly, not loud enough to disrupt the proceedings, but enough to signal that the room itself was starting to react, starting to question, and Emily stood unmoving, her posture steady, her gaze forward, as if the outcome of this moment had already been decided somewhere beyond what anyone else could see, her fingers resting lightly against the silver bracelet at her wrist, not gripping it now, not holding onto it for strength, but simply acknowledging its presence, like a quiet anchor to something deeper, something rooted in identity rather than circumstance. And as the judge opened the document, the faint rustle of paper seemed to stretch across the silence, each movement measured, intentional, giving nothing away too quickly, and for a brief second, his eyes paused on the first page, scanning, absorbing, and then something shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to most, but enough that the energy in the room changed again, subtle yet undeniable, like a current strengthening beneath still water, and Daniel noticed it, even if he could not define it, his jaw tightening slightly as he leaned forward just a fraction, as if proximity might grant him clarity, might allow him to reclaim the control that felt like it was slipping further away with each passing second, and Vanessa followed his movement instinctively, mirroring his tension, because whatever was happening now was no longer part of the performance she understood. No longer something she could navigate with confidence and calculated expression, and Olivia remained still, her hands resting calmly against the table, her eyes forward, not watching the judge, not watching Daniel or Vanessa, but Emily, as if she already knew that whatever came next would not need explanation, would not need argument, because truth, when it finally surfaces, does not ask for permission, it simply reveals itself, and above them all, Judge Carter turned a single page, then another, his movements steady, controlled, yet carrying a weight that pressed into the silence. And when he finally lifted his gaze again, it was no longer the gaze of a man searching for answers, it was the gaze of someone who had just found them, and in that moment, before a single word was spoken, the entire courtroom felt it, that quiet, irreversible shift, like a door that had just closed behind them, leaving only one direction forward, and for the first time since the hearing began, the outcome was no longer a question of who would win, but of how much would be revealed before it was over. When Judge Robert Carter finally spoke, he did not raise his voice, yet every person in the room leaned in as if the air itself had shifted to carry his words more clearly. Counselor, he said, directing his gaze toward Olivia Hayes, clarify for the court the origin of this submission. And the question, simple on the surface, carried a weight that settled into the silence like a stone dropped into still water, sending quiet ripples through every corner of the courtroom, and Olivia rose. Smoothly, her movements controlled, her voice steady as she responded. Your Honor, the document submitted is a certified record of identity, including hospital documentation, legal guardianship filings, and a notarized affidavit that was sealed for over 25 years. And a faint murmur stirred in the gallery, quickly suppressed, but impossible to ignore, because sealed records do not appear without reason, and they certainly do not appear in cases like this unless something far deeper is at stake, and Daniel's expression tightened, the irritation now replaced by something sharper, something closer to unease, as he shifted in his seat, his confidence no longer resting comfortably around him but pressing inward, constrained by variables he had not anticipated, and Vanessa glanced toward him again, her composure thinning further, her earlier certainty now giving way to something uncertain, something reactive. As if she were beginning to realize that the moment she had created had set something much larger into motion, something she could no longer control or even fully understand, and across the room Emily remained still, her posture unchanged, yet there was a quiet strength in her presence now, not loud, not performative, but undeniable, like a foundation that had always been there, simply waiting for the right moment to be seen, and the judge's gaze returned to her, not briefly this time, but with intention, with recognition that no longer needed to hide behind procedure, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something that reached beyond the authority of his position and into something far more personal. Miss Carter, he said, and the name no longer sounded like a formality, it sounded like something remembered, something reclaimed, and Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm, unwavering. Yes, Your Honor. And for a moment, time seemed to stretch, the silence between them no longer empty but filled with something that everyone in the room could feel but not yet define, and Daniel leaned forward again, his restraint beginning to fracture. Your Honor, I failed to see the relevance of this line of questioning, he said, his tone controlled but edged with frustration, and it was the first time he had openly challenged the direction of the proceeding, the first time he had attempted to pull the narrative back into something familiar, something manageable, but the judge did not look at him, not immediately, his attention remaining fixed on Emily as if the rest of the room had momentarily ceased to exist, and when he finally shifted his gaze toward Daniel, it was brief, measured, and carried no invitation for further interruption. You will have an opportunity to respond, he said, his voice even, final, and the simplicity of the statement closed the door Daniel had tried to open, leaving him with nothing but the growing realization that this was no longer a process he could steer, and Olivia spoke again, her tone precise, deliberate. Your Honor, the significance of this document lies not only in identity, but in relation. And that word, relation, seemed to settle heavily into the space, drawing every eye back to the bench, back to the judge, whose expression had shifted just enough to confirm what no one had yet said aloud, and in that moment, before the truth was spoken, before the connection was fully revealed, the courtroom understood something. Instinctively, something undeniable, that the story unfolding before them was no longer about divorce or assets or control, it was about something far more fundamental, something that could not be negotiated or dismissed, and as the silence deepened once more, it no longer felt uncertain, it felt inevitable, like the final seconds before a truth reveals itself and changes everything forever. The word relation did not fade, it settled heavy and immovable, as if it had been waiting years to be spoken in a room exactly like this, and for a moment no one moved, no one dared to interrupt what was forming in the space between the bench and the woman standing alone at the center of it all, because something deeper than legal procedure was unfolding, something that could not be argued away or redirected, and Judge Robert Carter's hand remained steady against the wood. Yet his eyes held something unmistakable now, something no longer hidden behind neutrality. And when he spoke again, the room leaned into the sound without realizing it. State your full name for the record, he said, his voice controlled, but carrying a quiet gravity that made the request feel less like a formality and more like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for decades. And Emily did not hesitate, her voice clear, unwavering. Emily Grace Carter. And the addition of her middle name landed differently, like a missing piece sliding into place. And the judge's breath paused, just for a fraction of a second, a detail so small it could have been missed by anyone not watching closely, but Daniel noticed it, because now he was watching everything, searching for something he could use, something he could control, and finding nothing, and Vanessa's expression tightened, her confidence no longer present, replaced by a growing discomfort she could not disguise. Because whatever was happening had moved beyond her understanding, beyond the simple narrative of power she had relied on, and Olivia Hayes stepped forward slightly, her voice steady. Your Honor, the documentation reflects that Emily Grace Carter was born at St. Vincent Medical Center, under circumstances that required immediate protective custody and sealed guardianship. And the words carried weight, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but factual in a way that made them impossible to dismiss, and the gallery shifted again, the quiet rustle of movement signaling that the room was beginning to understand the scale of what was being revealed, and the judge's gaze lowered briefly to the document, then returned to Emily, and this time there was no distance left, no professional barrier, only recognition, undeniable and complete, and when he spoke, it was softer, but somehow carried farther. Grace, he said, not as a title, not as a question, but as something remembered, something that had lived in silence for too long, and the name seemed to echo in the room, unfamiliar to most, but deeply rooted to the one person it belonged to, and Emily's expression did not break, did not shift dramatically, but there was a subtle change, a quiet acknowledgement, as if she had been waiting for that name to be spoken aloud, not for validation, but for truth, and Daniel felt it then, not just unease, but the unmistakable realization that he was standing at the edge of something irreversible, something that would not bend to influence or wealth or strategy, and he leaned forward again, his voice sharper now, less controlled. Your Honor, I object to this line of... But the judge raised his hand slightly, not abruptly, not forcefully, yet enough to stop the words before they could fully form, and the gesture carried authority that did not need reinforcement, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was decisive, and in that silence, the truth no longer felt hidden, it felt seconds away from being spoken in full, and for the first time since the hearing began, no one in the room was wondering what would happen next, they were waiting for it, because whatever came next was not just part of the case, it was the moment that would redefine everything that came before it. The name did not disappear after it was spoken, it lingered, echoing through the courtroom in a way that made everything else feel smaller, less important, and for a moment no one seemed willing to break what had just been set into motion, because some truths, once spoken, reshaped the air around them, and Judge Robert Carter remained still, his gaze fixed on Emily, no longer distant, no longer filtered through the detached lens of law, but direct, grounded in something far older than this room. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was steady, yet carried a depth that could not be mistaken. For the record, he said slowly, each word placed with intention. The court acknowledges the submitted documentation as valid and verified. And the statement landed like a quiet turning point, not dramatic, not loud, but final in a way that closed every door Daniel had hoped to keep open, and Daniel felt it immediately, the shift from control to consequence, his posture stiffening as he leaned forward, his voice breaking through the silence with a sharper edge than before. Your Honor, this is highly irregular, he said, the composure he had maintained now strained. We are here to address a divorce settlement, not... But he stopped himself, because even he could hear it, the weakness in his own argument, the way it no longer aligned with the direction the room had already taken, and the judge did not respond to him right away, not because he had not heard, but because Daniel's objection no longer held weight in a space where something far more significant had taken precedence, and Vanessa's expression shifted again, her earlier confidence now completely gone, replaced by a tight uncertainty she could not mask, her eyes moving quickly between Daniel and the bench, searching for stability that no longer existed, because the structure she had relied on had quietly collapsed without warning, and Olivia Hayes stepped forward once more. Her tone calm, precise. "Your Honor, with the court's acknowledgement, we would like to clarify the relational standing relevant to this case." And the word clarify felt deliberate, as if the truth was no longer hidden, only waiting to be formally recognized, and the judge gave a slight nod, not exaggerated, not theatrical, but enough to signal that the moment had arrived, that whatever had been building was now ready to be spoken without restraint, and the room seemed to lean forward collectively, every person present aware that they were witnessing something that would not be undone, something that would redefine not just the case, but everything surrounding it, and Emily remained exactly where she stood, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if she had already stepped beyond the moment, while everyone else was still catching up to it, and when the judge finally spoke again, there was no hesitation left, no distance. Only truth delivered with the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed to hide it. "The court further recognizes," he began, his voice unwavering, "that Emily Grace Carter is not only a party to this case, but—" and he paused, not out of uncertainty, but out of precision, allowing the weight of what came next to settle before it was spoken. "She is my daughter." And the words did not explode, they did not need to, because their impact was immediate and absolute. The silence that followed deeper than anything that had come before it, and in that silence, everything shifted at once, Daniel's composure cracking into something unmistakably shaken, Vanessa's confidence dissolving completely, the gallery erupting into restrained whispers that could not be contained, and at the center of it all, Emily did not move, did not react outwardly, because this moment was not a surprise to her, it was a truth she had carried quietly, patiently, waiting for the exact moment it could no longer be ignored, and above them all, Judge Robert Carter remained steady, his gaze no longer searching, no longer questioning, but anchored in something unchangeable, something that no argument, no wealth, no influence could overturn, and for the first time since the hearing began, the power in the room was no longer assumed, it was defined, clear and undeniable, and there was nothing left anyone could do to reverse it. The silence did not break all at once, it fractured slowly, like glass under pressure, beginning with a single breath somewhere in the gallery, then another, until the room was filled with the quiet, uncontrollable sound of people trying to process what they had just heard, because some revelations do not arrive as shock, they arrive as certainty, undeniable and irreversible. And Daniel Brooks felt it first in the way his body reacted before his mind could catch up, his posture no longer composed but rigid, his fingers pressing into the edge of the table as if holding on to something that no longer existed, his voice finally emerging, not loud, but strained in a way that betrayed everything he had tried to maintain. "That is not possible," he said, and the words fell flat the moment they left him, because possibility had already been replaced by fact, and Vanessa did not speak at all, her silence louder than anything she could have said, her eyes fixed on Emily now with something that no longer resembled confidence or superiority, but confusion, as if she were seeing her for the first time, not as an obstacle, not as someone beneath her, but as something she had completely misunderstood, and across the room Emily stood exactly as she had before, unchanged, her calm now no longer mistaken for weakness, but recognized as something else entirely. Something rooted in truth rather than circumstance, and Olivia Hayes allowed the moment to settle before speaking. Again, her voice steady, grounded. "Your Honor, with the court's acknowledgement, we would like to proceed with the full context of the financial disclosures and prior omissions." And the words shifted the focus once more, not away from the revelation, but deeper into its consequences, because truth does not exist in isolation, it connects, it exposes, it reveals everything it touches, and the judge nodded slightly, his gaze no longer divided, no longer uncertain, but fixed with clarity that left no room for interpretation. "Proceed," he said, and the single word carried authority that did not need reinforcement, and Daniel turned sharply toward his legal counsel, his composure now visibly fractured, searching for direction, for a strategy, for anything that could restore control, but the silence he received in return told him everything he needed to know, that this was no longer a situation that could be managed, no longer a narrative that could be redirected, and Vanessa shifted back in her seat, her earlier presence. Diminished, her posture no longer assertive but withdrawn, as if the weight of the room had finally caught up to her, pressing down in a way she could not escape, and Olivia placed another document forward, the movement calm, deliberate, each page carrying evidence that no longer needed dramatic presentation, because the foundation of power in the room had already changed, and as the clerk accepted the submission, the quiet rhythm of procedure resumed, but it no longer felt routine, it felt like the unfolding of something inevitable, something that had been building long before this day, and Judge Robert Carter leaned slightly forward, his voice steady, measured. The court will review all submitted evidence in full. And the words did not just signal continuation, they signaled consequence, because now every detail mattered, every omission, every decision, every action that had led to this moment, and Emily remained still, her presence no longer defined by what had been done to her, but by what had just been revealed, and for the first time since the hearing began, the room was no longer questioning her position, it was adjusting to it, recalibrating around a truth that could not be undone, and Daniel, sitting at the center of it all, understood something with absolute clarity, not through logic, not through strategy, but through the quiet collapse of everything he had relied on. That this was no longer a case he could win, it was a reality he could not escape. Control does not disappear in a single moment, it erodes quietly, piece by piece, until the person holding it realizes too late that there is nothing left to grip, and Daniel Brooks felt that erosion now with a clarity that cut deeper than any argument ever could, because for the first time in years, he was no longer dictating the pace, no longer shaping the narrative, he was reacting. And reaction is where power begins to fail, and as Olivia Hayes continued, her voice steady, deliberate, every word placed with precision, the structure Daniel had relied on began to collapse under the weight of facts he could not dismiss. Your Honor, we would like to direct the court's attention to the financial disclosures submitted during the initial proceedings, she said, sliding another document forward. Specifically the absence of several accounts and asset transfers that were not reported. And the clerk accepted the file, the quiet rhythm of documentation continuing, but the meaning behind it now far more significant than procedure, and Daniel's jaw tightened, his mind racing, calculating, searching for an angle, for a flaw, for anything that could disrupt what was unfolding, but every path led back to the same realization, that this was no longer a matter of influence, it was a matter of exposure, and exposure does not negotiate, it reveals, and Vanessa shifted further back in her seat. Her earlier composure gone entirely, replaced by a stillness that suggested she understood the danger now, not in the legal sense, but in the way the room had turned, in the way perception had shifted, because power is not just about position, it is about how others see you, and in this moment, no one was looking at her the way they had before, and Emily remained where she stood, unchanged, her presence now the quiet center of everything, not because she demanded attention, but because the truth had placed it there. And above them all, Judge Robert Carter listened, not passively, not distantly, but with a focus that carried both authority and something deeper, something personal that no longer needed to be hidden, and when he spoke, his voice was measured, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. Mr. Brooks, he said, and the use of Daniel's name, formal and direct, carried a finality that left no room for misinterpretation. The court will require a full accounting of all assets, including those not previously disclosed. And the statement did not invite response, it required it, and Daniel felt the shift immediately, the difference between a request and a directive, and for a moment, he said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that would restore what had already been lost, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was heavy, filled with the understanding that everything he had built, everything he had controlled, was now subject to scrutiny he could not escape, and Olivia did not press, did not rush, because she did not need to, the momentum was already in motion, and the judge's gaze moved once more, briefly, toward Emily, and in that brief moment, there was something unspoken, something that did not need language, because recognition had already been established. And then he returned his attention to the case, to the process, to the outcome that was now unfolding with a certainty no one could stop, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but revealing, because it was not frustration, not anger, it was realization, the kind that arrives when there are no more moves left to make, and across the room, Emily did not react, did not claim victory, because this was never about winning in the way Daniel understood it, it was about truth, and truth does not celebrate. It simply stands, undeniable, unshaken, as everything else rearranges itself around it. The room did not feel like a courtroom anymore, it felt like a place where something long overdue was finally being acknowledged, and as the weight of the judge's directive settled into every corner, the energy shifted from tension to inevitability. Because once truth is recognized, it does not retreat, it advances, steadily, relentlessly, until everything built around it is forced to adjust. And Daniel Brooks sat there in that realization, no longer searching for arguments, no longer calculating outcomes, but confronting something far more difficult, the loss of control he had once mistaken for permanence. And across from him, Olivia Hayes continued with the same measured precision, her voice calm, but each word carrying the quiet authority of someone who knew the outcome was no longer uncertain. Your Honor, in addition to the undisclosed financial records, we would also like to address the pattern of conduct relevant to this case, she said, and the phrase pattern of conduct did not sound dramatic, but it carried implications that reached far beyond numbers, far beyond documents, because patterns reveal intention, and intention reveals truth, and the judge listened without interruption, his posture steady, his gaze unwavering, not just absorbing the information, but weighing it, placing it into a context that no longer existed in isolation. Because now every detail connected back to something larger, something undeniable, and Vanessa shifted again, her presence now almost diminished, her earlier certainty replaced by a quiet withdrawal, as if she were trying to become invisible in a room that had already seen too much, and Daniel glanced toward her briefly, not with reassurance, but with something closer to distance, because in moments like this, alliances fracture, not loudly, but quietly, when survival replaces strategy. And Emily remained exactly where she had been, her stillness no longer questioned, no longer misunderstood, but recognized as something far stronger than reaction, something rooted in knowing, and above them all, Judge Robert Carter finally leaned back slightly, his voice cutting through the steady rhythm of proceedings with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. The court has heard sufficient preliminary evidence to proceed with full review and determination, he said, and the statement did not just move the case forward, it closed the space for delay, for manipulation, for anything that might have once shifted the outcome, and Daniel felt it in the way the room responded, not with noise, but with alignment, as if every person present had silently accepted what was coming next, and for the first time, he did not interrupt, did not object, because even he understood that the moment for resistance had passed, and the judge's gaze moved once more, briefly, toward Emily. And in that brief exchange, there was something that did not belong to the courtroom, something that existed beyond legal language, beyond formal recognition, something human, something final, and then it was gone, replaced again by the authority of the bench, and as the proceedings continued, the structure of the case now unfolding with a clarity that had been absent before, it became evident to everyone present that this was no longer about uncovering truth, it was about acknowledging it. About placing it into record in a way that could not be undone, and Daniel sat there, no longer at the center of control, but at the center of consequence, understanding with a quiet certainty that this was not the kind of loss that could be negotiated or minimized, it was the kind that redefined everything that came after it, and in the stillness that followed, there was no triumph, no celebration, only the steady, undeniable presence of truth, standing where power once believed it belonged. The final shift did not come with noise, it came with clarity, the kind that settles over a room and leaves no space for doubt, and as Judge Robert Carter reviewed the last of the submitted materials, the steady rhythm of pages turning marked the quiet progression towards something irreversible, because there are moments when a case stops being debated and starts being concluded. And everyone in that courtroom could feel that they had crossed that line, and when the judge finally closed the file in front of him, the soft sound carried more weight than any argument that had come before it, and he looked up, not scanning the room, not searching, but addressing it with a calm authority that had fully aligned with the truth now established. "The court has completed its preliminary review," he said, his voice even, measured, yet carrying a finality that settled into every corner of the space, "and finds sufficient cause to proceed with immediate determinations regarding asset disclosure, custodial consideration, and legal accountability." And each word landed with precision, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but definitive in a way that left no room for misinterpretation, and Daniel Brooks sat still, no longer resisting, no longer attempting to redirect what could not be changed, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet, unmistakable understanding that this was no longer about what he could control, it was about what had already been revealed. And across from him Vanessa remained silent, her presence diminished to the point of near invisibility, because the structure that had once supported her position had completely dissolved, leaving nothing behind but the consequences she could not avoid, and Olivia Hayes did not speak, did not need to, her role now complete in guiding the truth into the open, her stillness reflecting the certainty that the process had reached its natural conclusion. And at the center of it all Emily Carter stood as she always had. Unchanged in posture, unchanged in presence, but no longer seen the same way, because the room had shifted around her, recalibrated to a reality that had been hidden until this moment, and for the first time, she was not being evaluated, not being questioned, she was being recognized, and that recognition carried more power than anything that had been said or done throughout the proceedings, and Judge Carter's gaze moved to her once more, not as a judge addressing a party, but as something deeper. Something that existed beyond the formal structure of the courtroom, and though he did not speak that connection again, it remained present, undeniable, woven into the outcome that was now being set into record, and when he continued, his voice steady, grounded, "The court will issue formal orders reflecting these findings, effective immediately." The words did not signal an end, they signaled a resolution, a closing of one chapter and the irreversible beginning of another, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but final, because in that moment he understood something that no strategy had prepared him for, that loss is not always loud, sometimes it arrives in silence, in the absence of control, in the realization that everything you believed was secure has already shifted beyond your reach, and as the judge's gavel came down once more, not forcefully, but with a quiet certainty that marked the conclusion of the hearing, the room began to move again. People gathering their things, whispers returning, the world resuming its motion, but for those who had witnessed it, something had changed, something that would not be undone, and at the center of it all Emily did not rush, did not react outwardly, because this moment was not about reaction, it was about truth, and truth, once revealed, does not need to prove itself, it simply remains, steady and unshaken, as everything else learns to adjust around it. The courtroom did not empty all at once, it unraveled slowly, like a scene losing its intensity frame by frame, voices returning in low murmurs, footsteps echoing softly against polished floors, but at the center of it all, something remained still, something untouched by the movement around it, and that something was Emily Carter, who stood for a moment longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but out of quiet awareness, as if she understood that what had just happened was not something to rush away from, not something to escape, but something to acknowledge fully before stepping forward, and across the room Daniel Brooks rose from his seat with a stiffness that no longer carried authority, only the weight of realization, his eyes briefly lifting toward the bench, toward the man he had once seen as just another obstacle, and finding instead something he could not challenge, something he could not negotiate, and for the first time, he did not speak. Because there was nothing left to say that would change what had already been decided, and Vanessa moved quickly, almost instinctively, gathering her things without meeting anyone's eyes, her presence reduced to something small, something that no longer commanded attention, because attention had shifted, permanently, and Olivia Hayes placed a gentle hand near Emily's arm, not guiding, not directing, simply acknowledging, and Emily gave a small nod. A gesture that carried more meaning than any words could have, because this was never about the performance of victory. It was about the quiet certainty of truth finally standing in the open, and as she turned to leave, her steps were unhurried, measured, each one grounded in something steady, something that did not need validation from anyone in that room, and just before she reached the doors, there was a pause, subtle, almost imperceptible, and though she did not turn fully, her gaze lifted slightly. Just enough to meet the eyes of Judge Robert Carter one last time, and in that brief exchange, there were no titles, no formalities, no courtroom language, only something deeper, something that had found its way through years of silence and distance, something that did not need to be spoken again because it had already been understood. And then she continued forward, the doors opening with a soft sound that marked the transition from one world into another, from a space defined by judgment into one defined by possibility, and outside. The light felt different, not brighter, not softer, just clearer. As if everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only what mattered, and behind her, the courtroom returned to its ordinary rhythm, another case, another set of voices. But for those who had witnessed what unfolded, there would always be a quiet awareness that something rare had taken place, something that could not be reduced to paperwork or procedure, and somewhere inside that room, Daniel remained standing for a moment longer than expected, not because he had anything left to fight for, but because he had finally understood something he had spent years ignoring, that power is not measured by how much you control, but by how much truth you can stand when control is gone. And as he finally turned away, the weight of that understanding followed him, silent, inescapable, and at the center of it all, far beyond the courtroom, far beyond the moment, one truth remained. Steady and unshaken, that some men do not lose everything because they are weak. They lose everything because it is the only way they learn what dignity was worth all along.